There are many ways to remedy a wrong or to make up for a wrong suffered. There are many ways to behave. There are many opportunities that can be taken or not to change a story, maybe even to straighten its course. Well, our character today has chosen an original, not at all trivial way to find satisfaction for everything that has been inflicted on him. As for personal and physical suffering, our character left behind a rich documentation, an effective investigative method, and a name that has become synonymous with the pursuit of justice. Our character today is Simon Wiesenthal. As you may already know, for our videos we use historiographical sources that are often not easily accessible from our country, Italy. Even today, if you go to Vienna, you can visit a center called Simon Wiesenthal. It's a documentation center, a research center, a center that essentially works to find the truth and, above all, to avoid distortions or, even worse, lies. It's a center for investigating the Holocaust, that immense tragedy of the 20th century in which human beings persecuted other human beings, their own kind, for ethnic, linguistic, ideological, religious, and moral reasons. A madness we hope to never see again. That's exactly why the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the documentation center, exists, to prevent this from happening again. Because that man, Simon Wiesenthal, experienced human madness firsthand. Who was Simon Wiesenthal? He was a Galician Jew who grew up first in what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then in what would become Poland. He was an engineer, a railway engineer, very good at his job, and even part of that work would become useful to him. Years later, to save his wife Silla Müller, with her having agreed to marry him regardless of the persecutions. Yes, because Simon Wiesenthal was Jewish, and Jews, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but even more so in the reborn Poland, and later during the events of the Second World War, did not have an easy life. Simon Wiesenthal, for example, began to live his own nightmare after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after that wicked agreement between two great totalitarian regimes, two great dictatorships, both bloodthirsty, who decided to divide it even before they had conquered it. Poland, a large portion to Nazi Germany and the eastern provinces, including Lviv, to the Soviet Union. Simon Wiesenthal found himself changing citizenship 3 times in his life before he had even reached adulthood. First Austro-Hungarian citizenship, then Polish, then Soviet. But in 1941, after already suffering various abuses, first under the Poles, then as a subject of the Soviet Union. In 1941, Wiesenthal experienced the Nazi horror, Operation Barbarossa, the armed conquest of Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and part of European Russia. By the Nazi armed forces and their allies, Wiesenthal was arrested in a very short time. His background as a railway engineer helped him assist his wife in escaping. The Polish resistance. In exchange for the railway switch plans made by Wiesenthal himself, they provided Wiesenthal's wife with false documents that allowed her to avoid internment and escape. Wiesenthal wasn't so lucky. He endured years and years of suffering. First in the ghetto, one of the many ghettos organized by the Nazis, initially as a place of confinement, then the roundups, the mass killings, and later the concentration camps. Wiesenthal's wife managed to escape from Janowska, but Simon Wiesenthal was arrested there. He went from Janowska to Belzec. From Belzec, he was taken to other camps, more camps, where he met. A horror that can't even be communicated. It's so unbelievable, so disgusting. If a great Jewish writer like Primo Levi wrote, "If this is a man," there's a reason for it. What Simon Wiesenthal and many like him saw, managing to survive, is truly something indescribable. Wiesenthal went through several camps. He passed through Semisio, where today the border between Ukraine and Poland is. Some from his group ended up in Płaszów, that concentration camp immortalized by cinema in the film Schindler's List. It's been 30 years. Watch it again or catch it if you haven't yet. The survivors were evacuated to Gross Rosen, at least those who were not the Schindler Juden, Schindler's Jews. In Gross Rosen, people died. They died from disease, overcrowding, and hunger. Simon Wiesenthal got out of Gross Rosen by a miracle, without the big toe on his right foot. It had been amputated after an injury, at work in the quarry breaking stones like a common prisoner. From Gross Rosen, he had gone on one of the many death marches, leaning on the handle of a pickaxe to avoid falling, to survive. Why would Wiesenthal's mission become that of other Jews, to stay alive in order to tell what they had seen and what they had experienced? The death march from Gross Rosen ended at Mauthausen, a symbolic Holocaust site and extermination camp. And it was there that the Americans found Simon Wiesenthal, or rather what little was left of him, weighing just over 40 kilograms, a human skeleton like many others, reduced by hunger and deprivation. Wiesenthal, who had spent the last weeks as a prisoner in a barrack meant for the dying. Life, however, had clung to those few bones with great determination, the determination to stay and bear witness. And there, the second life of Simon Wiesenthal would begin. After reuniting with his wife Wiesenthal, he would devote himself to a new career, not as a railway engineer, but as a documentarian. From 1945-1947, for those 2 years, the Western and Soviet allies worked together to try to reconstruct what was the organizational structure of the Nazi regime, to bring those responsible for the horror to justice. It was not an easy collaboration, and it was destined to end abruptly. But within that collaboration, Wiesenthal and others like him formed a working group. They simply had to put in order the large SS archive, which had been found almost intact by the Americans in Berlin. Almost intact because the fleeing SS had left instructions, first of all to scatter the files and then to burn them. 95% was saved but mixed up for 2 years. The group, which included Simon Wiesenthal, reorganized the documents, helped with translations, and also helped to put the documents back in order. What was scattered, what seemed destroyed, what was only half destroyed, they reconstructed that archive. And that archive served as the basis not only for the trials, providing a foundation for moving forward, but also for the work. For many public prosecutors, for many offices of justice, even federal ones. That archive also served as the basis for the work of the Z Commission. We have already talked about it, addressing the issue of Bruno Streichenbach. You can find the video on the channel, but also about other war criminals. A commission founded by the Federal Republic of Germany to investigate the crimes of National Socialism to find those responsible. Because the serious concern, not only of the Federal Republic of Germany, but also of Wiesenthal himself and many other survivors like him, was about the escape of those responsible, or, even worse, that some of them had remained in the background of the new Germany, of the new Austria. Some with a new identity, others with the same first and last name, as if nothing had happened, as if basically everything had been forgotten. This became Simon Wiesenthal's mission. Unlike many, he was not an avenger. And in the period between 1945 and 1954, squads of avengers operated. Former detainees, former camp prisoners who were looking for their tormentors to kill them. Wiesenthal acted differently. He understood that the real way to hunt Nazis, to pursue them forever, to flush them out, was to prevent them from contaminating the new society with that disease germ. It was to rely on documents because if there was one thing the Nazi regime left behind, it was its bureaucratic machine, an incredible amount of documents, some in disarray, others well cataloged. Wiesenthal, from that moment on, decided to start working first alone and then in a group to catch major criminals. One of them, we made a video about one specifically. Eichmann was wanted, found in Argentina under the false identity of Ricardo Klemmer, identified by local witnesses who notified both Wiesenthal and the West German authorities, captured by the Israelis, secretly brought to Jerusalem, tried, and sentenced to death. There was significant controversy over Eichmann's trial, his death sentence, and Wiesenthal's involvement. It was said that Radovino did nothing or did very little. Others, on the contrary, testified that he was essential in reconstructing the long escape of the hierarch through Germany, Austria, Italy, and Argentina. He didn't stop. Simon Wiesenthal kept searching because, as we said, it was to prevent what had happened from happening again, to prevent those who had committed certain crimes from not only speaking openly, but even becoming an example for new generations, to prevent a degeneration. Society. Well, in his life, Simon Wiesenthal was able to achieve some successes as well. Let's think about Franz Stangl, former commander of Treblinka, and before that of Sobibor, and about Sobibor and the daring escape of some prisoners. We've reserved a special video on the channel. Franz Stangl was one of the first 50 names on the wanted list. Stangl had managed to escape from the Allies. He had escaped to Austria in May of 48. Then he arrived in Italy, in Rome. Caritas, the Catholic charity organization, had provided him with a Red Cross passport and a ticket to Syria. From Syria, then, Stangl migrated to Brazil in 1951. Well, Simon Wiesenthal, as he had already done with others, had applied a method that combined investigative journalism, private investigation, police work, and archiving. These four methods together had allowed Wiesenthal to find Stangl, just as Wiesenthal did. Imagine a puzzle, a big puzzle. You open the box and find all these pieces to fit together. At first, I know it's crazy. You think it's impossible. Then, little by little, you maybe find something that fits. But sometimes you can't find the right pieces. You even fear you might have lost them. Well, Wiesenthal applied the same method, the puzzle pieces. He fit the pieces together with great patience, without losing his mind, without getting distracted. Every time he got a new piece of information, he would verify it, and then, if possible, add it to the puzzle until he found a way to make all the pieces fit together. Franz Stangl was arrested by the Brazilian police on February 28, 1967, and extradited to Germany a few months later. His case had already been followed by Simon Wiesenthal, who had published a book, The Murderers Among Us. It was a book of denunciation, a book that clarified the role of the murderers with the twin lightning bolts of the SS, and the fact that not only had they survived, but they continued to live as responsible and respectable citizens, something that should make all our blood run cold. Wiesenthal looked for them. Others looked for Erwin Braunsteiner. The mayor of Majdanek, the mad mayor of Majdanek, the sadist, the cruel woman who got her nickname Mad Mare, because she would kick her victims, hysterical kicks until she caused their death, kicks with studded boots. She had also tried in vain to find Josef Mengele. She had identified him. He had managed to track him first in Greece, then in Cairo, in Spain, and Paraguay, but he was never able to capture him. At the beginning of the 1970s, Simon Wiesenthal received a visit from a British journalist and writer, Frederick Forsyth. Forsyth already had several successes to his name. First, as a war correspondent in Biafra, we've already talked about the Biafran Civil War, and then as a novelist. His debut novel, The Day of the Jackal, had become a worldwide bestseller and would soon be made into a film. Forsyth was working on a second novel, a novel set in Germany, featuring an investigative journalist as the protagonist and former Nazis who had remained in the shadows as the antagonists. And what better source than Simon Wiesenthal, known as the Nazi hunter, to research the subject? It was there that Wiesenthal had a stroke of genius. At the time, at the top of his most wanted list was a man we've already talked about, Edward Rochman, the butcher of Riga, former deputy commander of the ghetto, who had vanished into thin air in April 1945. Instead of creating a fictional villain, perhaps by using documentation on other war criminals, Wiesenthal suggested to Forsyth to use the name, surname, and career of a criminal who was currently uncatchable, a criminal that everyone was looking for, or at least everyone thought they were looking for, because Simon Wiesenthal had learned something else, The infiltration of former Nazis into post-war West German and Austrian society was so deep that the code word, the camaraderie, was stronger than the sense of justice. In many police offices, in many judicial offices, and in several law firms, there were former Nazis, some with their real names in plain sight, others with false identities. You couldn't fully trust anyone. Yet Forsyth's second book, The Odessa File, which was made into a film starring John Boyd, was another success. And it was while watching that film that a neighbor of the fugitive criminal recognized him in Argentina. In 1977, the case was reopened. Rockman had to flee, and he died of a heart attack after making his escape. It was a sign that Wiesenthal's work was effective. It was exhausting, difficult work, and not without risks. Wiesenthal faced several threats and was even targeted in attacks. But he persisted. He persisted because he wanted not only to find the truth, not only to find the murderers, but to make sure that society changed for the better. Wiesenthal faced criticism not just for the Eichmann case, but also for another case that would influence world opinion, the case of Kurt Waldheim, a leading Austrian politician. He became United Nations Secretary General in 1971. When this appointment happened, Wiesenthal was asked to conduct a check. He almost seemed to have become Simon Wiesenthal himself, a sort of notary who certified whether or not someone belonged to the old Nazi party or the SS. Wiesenthal trusted Waldheim, but he was mistaken. The check was not thorough. It was later discovered that Waldheim had been involved in the early Sturmabteilung, the stormtrooper squads of early Nazism, and that during the war he had been an officer. He had not committed the atrocities himself, but he was fully aware of everything that was happening, including the Holocaust, and he did nothing. The controversies that followed, which accompanied Waldheim until the end of his political career, also overwhelmed Wiesenthal, who had initially taken Waldheim's side, and then he had vainly called for his resignation. Everyone makes mistakes, even those who have tried their best to answer the worst questions. The rest of Simon Wiesenthal's life was spent continuing to study, trying to achieve what all of us would have wanted to see: justice. His wife Sheila died on November 10, 2003 at 95, 2 years before him. Simon died on September 20, 2005, age 96, and both were buried in El Zelia in Israel. In that land of Israel, which he felt he did not deserve because in the end, he hadn't managed to save enough people. He hadn't managed to find all the murderers. There are few who have remained outside the network of controls. We owe Simon Wiesenthal credit for authenticating, though few could say much else, a great testimony about the Holocaust. The testimony of Anne Frank's diary, that diary about which perhaps too much has been said, which has even been accused of being a forgery. Well, that diary is actually pure truth. And if we can say that with certainty, it's because memory helps to shed light on what is dark and stands as a bulwark, both against the darkness of the past and against certain attempts today to rewrite what happened, to minimize, to discredit, and also against certain attempts to bring back the past. Because what should make us reflect, what should scare us, and what we should understand is that evil sometimes returns. And if we are not ready to face it, if we don't know how it went before, if we don't have all the elements available, well, we might make a mistake, underestimating it, thinking that after all, it's nothing serious, or even worse, becoming ourselves unwitting supporters of evil. We cannot allow it. We cannot allow it for the 14 million people who died at the hands of Nazism. We cannot allow it. In memory of Simon Wiesenthal, a man who dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of truth,